And it's probably one of Jesus's better known stories.
I turned it off because I couldn't connect.
Or one more, oh, okay.
Yeah. It shows I'm hooked to the Wi-Fi, but for some reason it says cannot connect to Pandora, so I don't know.
Luke 15. And the reason I'm saying maybe 2 or 3 weeks, because, I mean, it's not a very long chapter, but it's packed. So in this chapter, Jesus tells 3 stories, and they're all 3 related. The first story he tells is about a farmer, a shepherd, who lost one of his sheep. And Jesus said what he did was he left the 99 and went looking for the one. Now, if you were a shepherd, you would understand that. If you were a hireling, you wouldn't. Because if you were the hireling, you were the hired man, you would think, one isn't that bad. I mean, we still got 99. That's not too bad. But for the shepherd, each one is significant. And then he says, and when he does find it, then he calls together and has a celebration to celebrate the fact he found his sheep. The second story Jesus tells is about a woman. And she has, well, we'll just use the modern words. She has $10. She lost one. And maybe $10 isn't the best way to say, but anyway, it'll come out the same. So she lost one. Well, she's pretty upset over this. So it says she lights a candle. We would say she turns on the lights, gets out of the room, and cleans house until she finds the $1 she lost. And then, what does she do? She throws a party to celebrate. She got her $1 back. I kind of chuckle at that one because she probably spent all that money throwing the party. But that's not the point. And then Jesus tells the third story. And it's the third story we want to concentrate on for, well, at least the rest of this month, if not longer. And before we begin looking at that, or even read that story, I'd like to say to us, let's make sure we read that story from verse 11 to 31, to 32, is it? Is that the last verse in that chapter? 31?
No, 32.
Okay,
Oh,
so
yeah, 32,
32,
sorry.
yeah. So I'd like us to say, I'd like to recommend, well, if I had the authority, I'd mandate.
You're watching too much news.
Yeah, I don't watch any. Read this through every day. It's not very long. Read this through until you just know this story inside, backwards, and upside down. But before we begin to look at that, would someone read verse 1? I said we were going to do it, but we're going to start with verse 1, and then we're going to jump.
Certain man had 2 sons.
No, verse 1.
Oh. On 15.
Yeah.
Then drew near unto him all the publicans and sinners for to hear him.
All right. Okay. Then drew near all the tax collectors and sinners. If you'll notice throughout the New Testament, the people at that time made a distinction between, what should I say, regular sinners and tax collectors. And the reason they had it in for tax collectors is because they were Jews who worked for the Roman government. And that was viewed as like disloyalty. And so tax collectors were, they were the bad guys.
Still are today.
Well, didn't they also line their own pockets? They charged more than the
Yes.
tax they had to turn in.
Yeah, that was the rule, is that you had to collect, let's say your taxes were $1,000, I don't know. Okay, so they had to turn in $1,000 to the government. But they could charge you $1,200 or $1,300 or whatever, and say that's how they padded their own pie. That's how they didn't get much for pay, and it's sort of like being a waitress. You get most money out of tips, so that was kind of how they operated. And another reason
Kinda
that
like
tax
how the
collectors were
government tax today.
so disliked is because most of them were rich at your expense. So if you remember Zacchaeus, he was a chief tax collector. I mean, he had ran the tax office for that whole region, and it says he was very rich. But when he met Jesus, he said, "I'm giving half of it back." And so that's just a little side. But what I wanted us to see here, it says the tax collectors and sinners came for to hear him. Okay, that sounds just like a very simple statement, doesn't it? But what it's saying to us, they came on purpose to hear him. This is why they came. They didn't just happen to show up. There wasn't a bulletin board that says Jesus is going to be preaching at 10 o'clock. They came on purpose to hear. They didn't just stumble in. And so I'm thinking, what about us? Tuesday nights, Sundays. Do we come on purpose to hear God? Or is it just, it's Tuesday, so we're going to go? Or Sunday. I used to get so upset with people who said, well, can't we have church earlier and get it over with? Well, if you want to get it over, why bother at all? So in case you don't know or haven't figured out, I've never been really very popular, and I guess I don't regret it, but because truth is what's most important. And I don't want to have church just to get it over with, but that we might meet and encounter God and encounter God in one another as we fellowship. So here's one group of people, the tax collectors and a variety of sinners. They came on purpose. They wanted to hear what Jesus has got to say. Okay, who will read verse 2?
And the Pharisees and scribes murmured, saying, This man received sinners and eats with them.
Yeah. All right. So the scribes, the Pharisees, the religious leaders, they were there on purpose too. But what's their purpose? To gripe, to complain, to find fault. I think they're still around. Those who manage to complain, find fault.
They're called Democrats.
and a lot of other things. But as you read the Gospels, notice how often those guys are there and they always finding fault. Remember when Jesus and the disciples, they were out walking and they happened to walk through a grain field and some of the disciples just pulled a few grains of head off, There's the Pharisees. I mean, didn't they have anything to do? That's my question. There they are. Say, hey, you guys are breaking the Sabbath, you're harvesting. And then I did some reading in the Jewish laws, that it wasn't that they picked the grain that was the sin, the crime. The crime was threshing it, grinding it together.
Working your hands on.
So, you know, picky, picky, picky. And isn't that where most complaints are today too, is about little picky things that don't really matter. But I wanted us to see these two distinctions. The sinners are here, they want to hear what Jesus got to say. The Pharisees are over here and saying, I mean, he's hanging out with them sinners again, them tax collectors. He can't be any good. And that was their attitude. Okay, so I told you the first two stories, we're going to do the third. And so let's see. Let's somebody start read 2 or 3 verses and stop, and then let somebody else read 2 or 3 verses. So we're starting at verse 11. It says, a certain man had 2 sons. There, at that point.
And the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the portion of goods that falls to me. So he divided to them his livelihood. And not many days after, the younger son gathered all together, journeyed to a far country, and there wasted his possessions with prodigal living. But when he had spent all, there arose a severe famine in that land, and he began to be in want.
So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, and he sent him into his fields to feed swine. And he would have gladly filled his stomach with the pods that the swine were eating, and no one was giving anything to him. But when he came to his senses, he said, How many of my father's hired men have more than enough bread, but I am dying here with hunger.
I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired men. So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him.
And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven, and in your sight I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to the servant, Bring out our best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and sandals on his feet. And bring the fattened calf here and kill it, and let us eat and be merry.
For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on.
Your brother has come, and he replied, and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound. The older brother became angry and refused to go in, so his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders, yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours who has squandered your property with prostitutes come home, you killed the fattened calf for him.
And he said to him, Son, you are always with me, and all that I have is yours. It is right that we should make merry and be glad, for your brother was dead and is alive again, and was lost and is found.
All right. You've all heard this story many times. I'm pretty sure. If you hadn't, you've heard it now. But Jesus' stories are more than stories. They are life lessons. And this, maybe it's because this is one of my favorite stories of Jesus's. Well, one of a lot of favorite stories, but not that I know exactly, but it's a puzzle to me that nobody made a movie of this, or maybe somebody has, because it would be a great movie. So let's look first of all at just some really basic things. So who are the characters in this story?
Father,
The father,
the son,
a younger son and an elder son.
and the servant.
There's the calf, yep. He's not gonna like this story very well.
Servant.
The servants, yeah. Okay, and, well, there's more than one, isn't there? Because there's the servants that were attending the father as he ran down the road. And then there's the servants around the house that the elder brother gets one of the guys and say, what's going on? So we got a bunch of characters. Well, tonight, I just want to look at one of them, the younger son. The younger son. What do we know about him? Just from this story. Okay, we know he's the younger of two sons.
He wasn't happy where he was.
He wasn't happy where he was. What else can we say about this young guy?
He wanted all his money.
He wanted everything now, yeah?
He went wild.
What's that?
He went wild.
He went wild, yes. Yeah.
He squandered.
He was breaking protocol too.
Yeah, and I'm sure he knew it, but,
He squandered all his money.
and he squandered all that. Going back to the breaking the protocol, you see, the custom at that time is if somebody wanted his dad's inheritance while the father was still living, it was actually a wish that the dad would die. And so that's the bad protocol. He's wishing his dad were dead so he could get his stuff. So pretty brazen. We can add that to him.
He was celebrated.
Huh?
He was celebrated.
Yeah, he was celebrating a lot. He was, I want to say a good word for him. He was adventurous.
He was in the world.
Huh?
He was in the world.
He was in the world. He was lacking of wisdom, lacking of manners.
He was, but apparently he had been taught all of that, and it was in there somewhere.
It's in there somewhere, yes. And
Somewhere.
I'm tired of it. Yeah.
He was a rebel.
There was rebellion, yes. So there he is. Give me my share. So what does the father do? He divides up. Notice it says his livelihood. Is that what you read? His living. It meant the Greek word that's used is bios, which means his life. This is everything. This represents his entire life, and he split it between the two boys.
Did he split it, or did the older boy get more? Isn't the older son supposed to get more? So did he get him maybe
Well,
a third?
yeah. Well, I mean, there is that.
Oh, okay.
So I'm not saying half and half, but they both got their share.
Yeah, okay.
They both got their share. And more than likely, the older son did get a bigger share. That's the culture in a lot of places. I'm not sure I really like it, but I probably should because I'm the older, but then.
Oh, you're the oldest one, then. There you go. A lot to share with them.
So here he is, young, lacking of wisdom, zealous, lustful, adventurous. He knows the rules, but he's rebellious. So it's not a very nice picture for the younger son. But Jesus tells us all these things almost in code, without lashing out at this boy. So the father divides. Then it says what? Not many days later, the younger son took everything he had and split. Went off to a far country. And notice it says he squandered. He squandered. Everything. I think it says squandered all his substance, right? Is that the word that's used? In some Bibles anyway. He squandered all his substance. Anyway, he blew it all in riotous living. Well, when you're a person like this young son, if you have money, you have friends. If you have abilities, if there's something you can do that others want, you have friends. But when it's gone, so is everybody else. And he finds himself lost and alone. Now what to do? Well, remember, he's a good Jew. So he might ask, why is he working with pigs? Well, probably because hunger is a strong motivator. So he hires out to some farmer, pig farmer, to tend pigs. And there, as he's tending pigs, he makes a discovery. The pigs have it better than he does. I mean, it says he would fain, this is King James word, he would fain have fed on the husks the pigs ate. I mean, he was that hungry, pig slop looked good.
If he's hired out, what's that given him? A place to sleep on, I wonder?
That's about it, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, he's on his own, but he had a place to stay. Not far from the pig pen usually.
Yeah.
So there he is. The pigs are eating well, he's not. Gives him time to do a lot of thinking. A lot of time to do some thinking. And while he's thinking, what's the first thought that comes to his mind? His father. The very one he wanted to get away from. All of a sudden, the father. And before we get heap too much praise on him, the reason he's thinking of his father is not really thinking about his father, he's thinking about himself. Because what does he say? How many of my father's hired servants have plenty to eat, and I'm over here starving? Then I like the next statement. It says, he came to his senses. Some of the Bible say he came to himself. He came to his senses. He hadn't been there for a long time.
Getting that pig job actually was the beginning of his coming to his senses.
coming to his senses.
It was a humility, like you said.
Yeah.
Because the Jewish people, those were unclean animals.
Yeah,
And for him to be amongst them.
yeah,
Suffer a lot of humility that way.
yeah. Yeah. I think the pig job was really of God,
Yeah.
because it's what got him to start thinking. I mean, what if he'd hired out and he got a nice job and, you know,
Regain as well.
and, yeah, he wouldn't learn a thing.
He would have continued his
Right.
His
Prodigal
lustful,
living.
prodigal life, yes, he would. So he came to his senses, and he thought about his father, and he thought about his belly. And a measure of humility is being expressed. I'm no longer worthy to be the son. So I want you to keep that thought in mind, because I don't know if we'll get back to it tonight or not. But he considered himself no longer worthy to be a son. So not only to come to his senses, then he came to a decision. I will arise and I will go to my father and I will say, I have sinned. I'm not worthy to be called your son. I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. Take me on as one of your hired men. Nice speech that you never really got to give. So I'm thinking about him. Okay, he came to his senses, he came to a decision, and then he did something that a lot of people don't quite get to. He actually carried it out. He came to his father. He came to his father. He had a plan, he carried it out, he came to his father. And while he was still just a dot on the horizon, his dad recognizes him. And the dad does what no dad should ever do, run. That was honorable men never did. But he wasn't guarding his honor. He saw his son. So what do you think? His dad was just lollygagging around and just happened to spot him?
Waiting for him.
He's been waiting for him. When do you think he started waiting for his son to come home?
The minute his son left.
The day he left. The day he left. There was, in the Lutheran Church, there was an evangelist named Oscar Hansen. I probably shouldn't say names, but it's a common name. Anyway, he traveled a lot in evangelism, and he had a wife, some children, and sometimes he'd be gone for quite lengthy periods of time. And his wife was one time asked about all of what was going on, and so she was asked something about his return. When do you expect his return? She said, the minute he pulls out of the driveway, I start waiting. Well, I think that was true of his father. I know there's a lot of questions people raise, and they say, well, why did the father do it? I mean, he should have known better. We'll get to that later. But for now, let's look at this boy. I'll call him a boy. So he comes home. The Bible says his father saw him and ran to meet him and hugged him, kissed him. Didn't even ask him to take a bath. People living in pig pens usually don't have the best fragrance.
He probably smelled them before he seen
He
them.
probably did. But see, all of this is there to have something to say about the Father. We'll get, but not tonight. So there's the Father. He's receiving him, just like that. And here's the boy. He's trying to say, Father, I have sinned against heaven. And then you're like, bring a robe. And I'm no more worthy. Bring some shoes too. You know, is the Father even listening? He's not even listening. Because all that he's got to say is not worth hearing.
What would have been the purpose of the ring?
That would be like a status that he was indeed a son. Yeah. So,
What do you think? Maybe the Father knew all along that his son would return eventually?
oh, I'm sure of that.
Because the Father is, usually knows what's going on in
Yeah.
the world.
Yeah.
And he knows, he's got the
And he knows
wisdom
his
to know.
kids.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the son is restored. The robe, the ring, the shoes are all symbols of his position as a son in this family. The ring kind of thing is, families have like crests. Yeah. And so,
He's restored to be the heir of the
yeah.
family.
So he's restored to the home, but he's broke. But that doesn't matter anymore. He's home. He's got a father who cares, a father who loves him. There are just so many things I want to try to share with you all. But I want to go back because these three people, especially the younger son, the older son, and the father, they're all intermingled. But I'm trying to separate each one out for some specific observation. So let's go back to the pig pen. And what was the son's confession? I am no longer worthy to be called a son. Now, we've all had parents, right? And you were born into that particular family. What worth did you have to be a son or a daughter? You had nothing to do with it. If you're a son, you're a son. If you're a daughter, you're a daughter. It wasn't anything you did. And so the sad thing is, even as far back as this, it seems through religion, and the Pharisees were the big religious groups, it seems that relationships had taken a back seat. Okay, I am my father's son. There's nothing I can do to undo that. If I'm as honorable as can be, I'm no more of a son than if I were rebellious as all get out. I'm still the son. What I see, and I want to share with you all, Because I think probably, I'll say most of us probably have wished that we were someone else at some time. Which you can't be. You can only be you. But I see this throughout the pages of the scripture, and I'm talking now mostly New Testament. That's in the Old Testament as well. That Satan, I'll say, really enjoys robbing us of our identity. He robbed this young man of his identity. You're not worthy to be a son. All you're good for is being a hired man. But even hired men are sons. So, among so many lessons here in this short story, and that's the one I want to challenge us. Don't let Satan steal your identity. I mean, you hear that in the world today, isn't it? Identity theft. Well, don't lose yours. You're the son, the child of God. And I expect that all of us have at one time or another felt like, well, I don't know, I'm not much of a son or a daughter of God. I screwed up here, I blew it there. And we did. But it didn't change our identity. As we think about the fathers you brought up, the father knew this kid well enough to know one of these days he'll come dragging home. And he did, just that, didn't he? He dragged himself home. Which is one reason I think the father met him so far back. To get him back on his feet, not dragging. Come home, you're the son, my son. Come with some dignity. Yeah, you're dirty and all that. We have water. And I know when we very often go through this story called The Prodigal Son, which I don't think is a very good name, because there are two prodigal sons. And we'll see that in the other boy later on. But this kind of fits into what I tried to share on Sunday. You know, if you've been a pretty good person all your life and then you come to know the Lord, it's not dramatic. And so it doesn't seem as vital as if you messed up like this guy did. And then he comes home and the father just receives him like that. Well, those of us who were pretty good kids, the father received us with just the same joy, the same excitement. But I think the sad thing is we don't see it as powerful and as valuable as those who have gone through a hard time. It doesn't have to be that way, but I think we've been trained that way by the world's standards. I mean, I've even heard nice pastors in nice places I think of one young person who was kind of a model kid. Did good in school. I mean, yeah, he was a good kid. But one day he came seeking, God was speaking to him, the need to be begotten, be born from above. And the preacher says something like, "You've always been a good kid." Well, it's one thing being a good kid and lost. This was a good kid too at one time. Here he is lost. And not even wanting to get back into the family as much as wanting to have a few square meals a day. But his father is not buying into that. Just like the Father won't buy into us, good or bad. And, you know, we were all created by God. None of us is an accident. And I think I mentioned this on Sunday, that before God created the whole world, he chose us, he chose me, he chose you. That's why I said, he's known us longer than the world has existed. And we say, how can that be? Don't ask. You embrace that truth that God gives us. But see, no matter how bad the pig pen gets, somehow or another, God will get through to that person. There is a home, and there is a Father. Some of us have loved ones who don't know the Lord. Some are still in a pig pen. But some haven't been there long enough yet. But we who do care and pray and believe can believe that God will get through to them. The Gospel of John in the first chapter tells us that Jesus came into the world to enlighten every man. There's not one person who can ever say, I didn't know. Because God put within every one of us, you hear, I guess the philosophers call it a divine spark. I don't really care what you call it, but actually it's the light of Christ, enabling us to make a decision for Christ. You can't just up and say, well, I'm going to follow Jesus. No one comes to the Father, to Jesus, except the Father draw him. And this young son was way out there in the far country. The Father is here. But what was drawing him? The Father. The Father was drawing him. And so came to his senses, came to a decision, and came to his Father, and probably was shocked out of his socks. Well, he didn't have any socks. Because he thought he had, he did have it worked out pretty good, right? He had a pretty good plan. Yeah, okay, just take me on as one of the hired men, and at least I'll be near, I'll be here. The Father wasn't looking for hired men. He was looking for the return of his Son. I know this isn't much like teaching, this is more like preaching, I think, but I spend a lot of time in this chapter with these guys. And also, I believe this, I think every last one of us can identify with the prodigal. We've been where he is. Maybe totally different circumstances, but we've been there. Haven't we been self-centered? Haven't we been lustful? Haven't we been rebellious? Haven't we done stupid stuff, lacking wisdom? We've all been here. And we can, And it's fairly easy for us to identify, isn't it, you know? To be identifying with the prodigal son. And as you think back through your life, you think about when you first accepted the Lord, realize that no matter what plan you had, God had a plan for you as his child. And did you know his plan prevails? His plan prevails. Many years ago when I was at the seminary, a German author by the name of Helmut Thielicke wrote a book about the various parables of Jesus. And in his teaching on this part of the prodigal son, he makes this wonderful comment. He said there will always be a homecoming because there is a home. There is a home. And it's our Father's home. So notice, all three stories, the lost sheep, the lost coin, the lost son. What did it engender? A party. A party. And what does Jesus say? There is more joy in heaven than even this father could pull off. You know, there they are. They'd been fattening this calf for a special occasion. I guess this was it. And much to the elder brother's chagrin, but we'll get to him. It's good lessons about that elder brother as well, elder son. Okay, you guys say something here.
The son must have known God because he said, I've sinned against heaven.
Yeah. Yeah.
So he knew that he'd done wrong. He knew that, you know. I think he knew right from the start
Oh, yeah. I mean, he'd
that he
known
was
this
on
all
a
along.
journey.
Yeah, he was running from God.
I'm sorry.
Huh?
I have to bring him back.
Yeah, you have to bring him back. And stay awake.
I'm trying to.
Kyle, nice to see you.
Safe trip.
Come back. All right?
Miss you. Bye, buddy.
Come again.
I'll see you tomorrow, Kyle.
Wendy said hi to you.
Yeah, Kyle will be here tomorrow, I think. Right?
We're dissecting things in biology class.
Okay.
Oh, goody.
Either tomorrow or in 2 weeks, because we got 2 weeks of science.
Oh, when did you?
Worm is an alpha.
And a what?
12 o'clock.
Tomorrow?
You know something that's left out?
Oh, boy.
We're not
A
told
worm, what?
how long this took.
No.
Oh, owl.
And we don't know what happened afterwards.
Yeah. And all it says that it wasn't just a family, it was a severe family.
Yeah.
And we have no
I think
idea.
that smells awful.
Um,
The owl pods.
I can relate to this because I had a situation with one of my older boys that was like this. He had a college fund set up for him. His name and my name were on the account, so that I didn't have to pay taxes on the account, and because his name was used as part owner. And it got up pretty well. And what I didn't know is that it was being tapped into.
They didn't ask.
And, no, yeah, he was on his own at this time, and I didn't know he was being tapped into until one day I went to, well, I got a statement, I think it was, you know how they give you statements. And usually I don't pay attention to them, you open up the envelope, and I filed it. I opened it up and there was nothing in there, nothing.
Yeah.
So he did, I found out, he did exactly the with the young lawyer.
When things go,
He
yes.
squandered it with his friends. And I know this because 18 years later, he confessed it
Yeah.
and apologized, just like this one.
Yeah.
He came to me and apologized for what he did. He was going to HCCC at the time and had to pay for it out of his pocket now because the funds were gone.
Yeah.
And he had one more semester to pay for, and I paid it for him, and that's what broke him. He realized that I was willing to
Still
still support him despite what happened, and then he broke down.
Yeah.
He came 18 years after the fact. He came and apologized for what he did. The most sincerest apology I've seen from any of the kids ever had.
There's really no expiration date. 18 years, how long was he gone? I don't know. We don't know. There's a lot of parts of the story we don't know. Because that's, I'll say, none of our business. But it's interesting to contemplate.
You noticed that the people he had the wild time with, they weren't around
No?
to help him. Gone. Money's gone,
Yeah.
they're gone.
They're gone. That's how it happens.
In a sense, that, what drew us to our Father in heaven was our wild, sinful ways,
Yeah.
and we come to know the Lord, and we can always go back to our Father,
Right. Oh, you can always
because
go
our
back.
Father will always accept us.
You can always go home. You can always go home. Okay.
Say I can relate to this totally because, and you said some things that relate to a program that I go to.
Yeah.
But he hit rock bottom. He literally
Yeah.
hit rock bottom.
Yeah.
Laying in pigs.
Yeah.
Part we don't eat.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then he turned it around and it's like you were saying, like, he came to believe, he came back, you know, he came to believe, you know, and he returned, and the Father's gonna rejoice in our not returning every time.
Right.
And that's, you know, that's what I took from that, like, no matter what he did, he's still a son, and he accepted that, you
Still
know.
the son.
Yeah, and the Father is always gonna rejoice in us coming home, always.
Always. I think one of the things I want us to, one of the reasons I said read through this story at least once a day. If once is good, 2 or 3 times is better. But what I want us to see is, see this from God's perspective, not ours. Because we can understand some of this. But if you had an experience like Merv just mentioned, you can understand the Father. You'd be ready to take him back. And did you notice one thing? Didn't ask any questions. He didn't come off and say, I told you this would happen. That would have sent him back. So, yeah. So let's just park it right here. And we'll go on with the story. So next week we'll try to get acquainted with the older brother. And, you know, in so many ways they're alike, and in so many ways they're so different.
You would think that the older brother would have wanted his path to take off. But the older brother stood around.
He was a good boy. Yeah.
Huh? Just be 2 of my boys.
See kids in those?
I can guess which one would.
Which one do what?
Which one would stay home and help? Please, Mom and Dad.
Okay, so that's part 1. It'll probably be part 1A eventually, but